It's interesting that there's so many parallels with other forms of labour that I think with the sex element, people don't always understand that because we have so many moral hang-ups. As a society, there are so many moral hang-ups around sex, when really for a lot of people in the industry, it's a job like any other.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news, and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou, ko Julianne Evans toko ingoa. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts. And today I'm talking to Dr. Cheryl Ware, who is an Honorary Research Fellow in History in the Faculty of Arts, and she has expertise in oral history, the histories of sex, gender and health in late 20th century Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in Australia. Tēnā koe, Cheryl. Lovely to have you here.
Tēnā koe, Julian. Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
Now, you have just written a very exciting new book, which will be published by Auckland University Press, I believe, early next year. It's funded by a Marsden grant, as far as I know, and it's called Untold Intimacies, Histories of Sex Work in Aotearoa, New Zealand, 1978 to 2008. Now, this is a really interesting topic because I honestly don't think many of us know very much about it. We're sort of aware of it around the edges, but we've seldom ever really talked to anyone probably who's been in this kind of business, and yet it has been all around us. How did you come to writing it? What motivated you?
I've always been interested in histories of gender and sex and histories of sexuality, and I wrote my first book on gay men living with HIV in Sydney during the HIV and AIDS epidemic, and that started as a PhD, and then I published that in 2019 with Palgrave Macmillan. Some of the men I interviewed for that project started talking about being involved in the sex industry really lightly, so renting an apartment and casually seeing clients, not working for a parlour or street-based work. So they weren't reliant on it for their income, but it was something that seemed to be an important part of their lives. And because my interest was in HIV and AIDS, they were talking about how clients were more receptive to using condoms than they were in their personal lives because of these stereotypes about sex workers and HIV and AIDS and being a risk of transmission. Because I was especially interested in gender and histories of sex and sexuality, when I came back to New Zealand, I found that this is an area that I really wanted to pursue for a few reasons. And there are a few stereotypes that I wanted to come up against, or maybe not stereotypes, but these, I'm going to call them misconceptions about the 1970s, 1980s, which in itself is a period I'm interested in because of the onset of HIV and AIDS in the early 1980s, but also because this period is often characterized as one where attitudes towards sex and sexuality were a lot more open. On top of that, you have depictions of New Zealand as a liberal nation, as a pioneer for the rights of women in particular, yet at the same time, we have one of the highest rates of domestic violence in the world. And so there's a lot of tensions in the scholarship and in public opinion that I was interested in teasing out and seeing if and how these changes impacted on the lives of those in the industry, which at the time was criminalised. And as I mentioned in the book, it's an industry that's been talked about a lot and not always spoken to.
Yeah. And it was around that time too, was the Homosexual Law Reform Bill as well, 1986, wasn't
Absolutely.
it? I actually remember that. I remember protesting in favour of that passing. But it wasn't until a lot later that sex work was decriminalised, was it?
Not till 2003.
Yeah, so that's a lot later.
It is, but it is, yes. And so New Zealand was the first country in the world to decriminalise sex work. It is important to note the semantics there. So sex work, or most elements of sex work, were decriminalised in New South Wales since 1995. But New Zealand being the first to decriminalise on a national level, and that's also because of the differences in our law. We have one national law, whereas in Australia there's state-based. But on top of that, New Zealand did remain the only country in the world where sex work was decriminalised for about 20 years.
Gosh, so we were ahead of our time there. But I imagine that decriminalising it didn't necessarily mean it then became a really nice thing to do in terms of, safety or public opinion or any of the ways in which people view that work.
It's such an interesting topic, because one of the real misconceptions that I've realised through doing the interviews and through the book is that sex work is often depicted as a last resort for people in a desperate situation. And the people I interviewed, some, yes, absolutely, some joined the sex industry for financial necessity and really resented their time there. A lot of the people I spoke with entered the sex industry either inadvertently as adolescents, engaging in sex acts with strangers they met, and then receiving money and realizing that they were being paid, but
not starting out that
way.
way.
No, absolutely. To people who deliberately entered sex work for either financial gain or personal gain, as well as an opportunity to push their own boundaries. And so it's interesting that there's so many parallels with other forms of labour, that I think with the sex element, people don't always understand that because we have so many moral hang-ups as a society. There are so many moral hang-ups around sex, when really for a lot of people in the industry it's a job like any other. Your point about decriminalisation, for some people it gave them, I guess, the assurance that what they were doing, that their work was absolutely the same. It was a job like any other, and they're supported under employment legislation. And for some people, it seemed to have no effect at all, because they were working anyway, and for whatever reason, they were able to avoid being targeted by police. At the same time, prejudice has and continues to prevail, and misconceptions about sex work, negative stereotypes that belittle those in the industry and their clients, which are often in direct contrast to how people in the industry view their experiences and how they spoke to me about their experiences.
Yeah, which brings me to my one question I had, which is, how did you get to speak to these people? Because you said something like 25 individuals. That's a lot of people, and I imagine that if you're talking about that period of time, some of them would have been older, some are still relatively young, depending on how you categorise youth. But how did you find out about them?
I am very, very grateful to have had a lot of support when I was doing this project. So the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, especially the Auckland and Wellington branches have been, and Tauranga, of course, and Christchurch, depending on where I was at the time, were incredibly supportive. They shared information about my project with their networks. Karen Wilton has also done a really great oral history project called Selling Sex, and her interviews are in the National Library, and she shared interviews with me with, of course, the participants' permission.
Who is Karen Wilton?
Karen Wilton is an oral historian, and she wrote My Body, My Business, Sex Work as an Era of Change, and that came out in 2018.
She's a New Zealander?
She's a New Zealander based in the Wairarapa, and wrote an excellent book based on the lives of sex workers. And she was very supportive. There's also Eurydice Aroni in New South Wales, who's a journalism academic who also did interviews with sex workers and allies about decriminalisation, about the fight for decriminalisation. And Eurydice also shared some of her interviews with me as well. And on top of that, there was Twitter, which I tried Facebook and Twitter. I found Twitter was a very effective way to reach a wide range of people, some of whom were involved with the NZPC and some of whom had no association with the organisation.
And how did you put that across to people? What did you say you were doing? That you were writing a book and that you would like to talk to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I created an advertisement with support from the Ethics Committee at the University of Auckland, and I posted that at the NZPC. They shared it with their networks. Some people shared it through word of mouth. They posted it on other sex worker blogs, and of course I shared that on Twitter and asked people to retweet it. And so again, there was a lot of support there, with people even sharing news that I was trying to recruit people and speak to people about their work.
And people came forward in their droves by the sounds of it. Did you have any particular criteria, or did you just speak to anyone that said they would speak to you?
I spoke to anyone who worked before 2008. It wasn't necessarily in their droves. I really wanted to interview Thai workers or women of Asian descent. That's both personal and professional. My mother's Filipino and came to New Zealand in the 1980s as one of the first Filipino women in Aotearoa. And I was interested in that time and a lot of cultural expectations to support family overseas, working in a new country, sometimes raising families. And there were also a lot of media reports at that time about Thai workers. There were visa waivers in 1987, which meant individuals from 4 countries could come to New Zealand on 3-month visitor visas without needing to fulfill a particular criteria.
So who else in general, I mean, obviously not their names, because I imagine they are anonymous, are they?
Some are.
Yeah.
For some, using their real name was very important, and it's a very important political act as well, to identify themselves as sex workers and reject that stereotype or reject any negative depictions of sex workers by rejecting any of the shame and by owning it. Absolutely, absolutely. But the interviews or the book covers a whole range of people who started sex work as adolescents, as I mentioned before, to people in their mid to late 30s, people from whangarei to Invercargill.
Men and women, trans people.
Yes, absolutely. Men, women, cisgender women, transgender women, whakawahine individuals from Māori, Pasifika, Pākehā, and who'd worked on the ships, massage parlours, escort agencies, on the streets, and privately indoors for themselves as well.
And what were some of the things, did they have some common themes that they talked about, some things that in the book you feel that you've now got a handle on what some of those things are?
Yes, absolutely. And so the book covers the key themes that emerged in the interviews, and so that moves us through individuals' experiences of working outside the law, the importance and implications of publicly identifying as sex workers, sexual health activism, especially with the onset of HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, and sex workers were really at the front, alongside gay activists, of course. Gay activists led a lot of HIV and AIDS prevention in New Zealand. Yes, absolutely, in New Zealand and elsewhere. And the HIV and AIDS epidemic was really what started the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. They mobilised, a group of 9 parlour workers mobilised in response to their general concerns about management, but also to discuss ways to keep HIV and AIDS out of the sex industry. Sex workers were already on the front lines of using condoms. That was important for their work, and conducting their own sexual health checks, sometimes with doctors, but also visible examinations of clients, and liaising with medical professionals, especially in Auckland, the Auckland Sexual Health Centre, to make sure that sex workers had access to sex worker-friendly medical professionals. And on top of that, the book also goes through the fight for decriminalisation, individuals' experiences and reflections on sex work, and changing discussions about consent as well was a really key theme.
And what do you mean by that?
So stealthing, I'm not sure if you've heard the term, stealthing made national headlines in September 2021, which was when a Wellington man was convicted for rape for covertly removing a condom with a woman employed in a Wellington parlour.
I vaguely heard about that,
yes. Yeah. And that was really celebrated in international news as well as being the first of its kind, where there was this acknowledgement that any act that breaches the conditions that you set out when you agree to have sex with someone that's a violation of their consent. That's rape. And
it's a human rights and workers issue.
Absolutely. But sex workers were talking about covert condom removal as a crime of rape since the 1980s. And they were talking about lack of payment as a crime of rape because you agree to have sex with someone for a particular fee. And
that's a verbal contract, isn't it?
It is. But in the court of law and in public opinion, it wasn't always. And so when there are one of the hard things going through the reading in the 1980s was there were a lot of, even judges in Victoria especially, there were some infamous cases where judges gave rapists more lenient sentences because the victim was a sex worker. And
this is Victoria,
yes,
Australia.
Victoria,
Yeah.
Australia. And sex worker activists in New Zealand were part of these debates and really writing in various newspapers against that. And so the interesting point about doing the interviews in around 2021, 2022 is that discussions about sexual violence and consent have really reached centre stage before that point. We've got the international Me Too movement. We've got Time's Up campaign, the Time's Up campaign. And so we've all these global movements that at the moment we're talking about consent and we're talking about empowerment and we're talking about body autonomy.
And
then
date
going
rape
through
and,
all of these issues and going through the interviews and going through the community newsletters, you realise that sex workers were really fighting for this from the 1980s, well before it came to the mainstream press and well before these acts as rape were recognised in courts.
So they were brave, really, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Because they risked a lot by speaking out.
Yes, and even identifying themselves as sex workers carried a huge risk. When the Prostitutes Collective first came out in Wellington and identified themselves as sex workers, the first vice squad that were in charge at the time, publicly supported them and spoke in favour of them in the media, saying that they're well organised and they're well informed and that they are the great people to lead a movement at that time with the onset of HIV and AIDS. Subsequent vice squads were not as supportive, and they responded to the public visibility of sex worker groups by conducting a major raid on 9 parlours, arresting a lot of the women employed in parlours, hosting a private meeting with parlour managers, and Catherine Healy attended that as representative from the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. And that was really a response to the increasing visibility of sex worker communities. On top of that, individual sex workers who spoke in the media as members of the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective found themselves losing clients, found themselves being, I guess, sidelined sometimes in the parlours they worked because they were seen as a liability. And they were seen...
Troublemakers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they were seen as somebody who would bring heat on the parlour. And of course, when you're working outside the law, you don't want one of your colleagues doing that.
Yeah. Did you notice a difference between people who are working there, I don't know how you can say this, for themselves, as opposed to in parlours in terms of their feelings of empowerment and or exploitation by other people? I mean, were there sex workers who felt they were being exploited by the people running those parlours?
In the community newsletter Siren, absolutely. And that was a big shift to the increasing number of people moving into private independent work around 1990. At that time, parlour managers were implementing shift fees, they were implementing fines. 1990s, as you know, was a tough time for everybody. We had the stock market crash of 1987, and it was a really tough time economically. And the introduction of shift fees and cleaning fees, late fines, fines for breaking the dress code, all of these extra economic pressures meant that some sex workers in parlours left their shift owing more than they had earned.
What's a shift fee?
A shift fee is a fee for going to work that day. And so it's a fee, essentially it was a fee for the use of the parlour, which
like
was...
a rental almost.
Yes, yes, and it was implemented per shift. That became common occurrence in the 1990s, and as some parlour employers were saying, the lack of any law meant that if they refused to pay the fee, then the managers were in a position to fire them. Absolutely.
With no holiday pay, no sick pay.
No.
No references, probably.
No, and then, of course, you've got a gap on your CV as well. Yeah. And there was a lot of movement between different industries, so people who worked in parlours didn't necessarily exclusively work there. They'd varied between working in parlours, working in escort agencies, and working for themselves. So there was a lot of movement.
And as dancers maybe as well? Or did you not speak to people who were essentially dancers who moved into other areas?
That's a great question. I spoke to one person who had worked at a major strip club in downtown Auckland, and she spoke about a tension there, or a divide where among her colleagues at the strip club, crossing over, as they put it, and working in the sex industry was hugely frowned upon, even though there was a lot of movement. And that was due to concerns that others would be allowing patrons to give them extra tips for extras, meaning sexual services, and then you're running the risk of undercutting each other's money and becoming more popular with patrons by
offering
agreeing
something else
to acts that most people won't.
Yeah. Well,
And so I interviewed one person. It was more common in the 1970s, especially with trans and whakawahine workers who sometimes worked at Club Exotique in Wellington and then supplemented their income from Club Exotique with street-based work.
Because you do sort of imagine that street work would be more risky. Was that the case?
There was, in the sense that you were on your own to screen people, and there's the visibility there as well. And so, and on top of that, you have police posing as clients and then arresting you for entrapment. So there's a whole lot of issues, and violence from the wider public. In contrast to that, a lot of people gravitated towards the street in pursuit of a community with whom they can explore their genders, their sexualities. It was especially the case from the 1970s with the rise of trans and whakawahine communities on the streets, especially Wellington and inner city Auckland.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? That sense of we're all in this together and we're connected.
Yes, and they also had their own ways of looking after one another. That was recording recording the number plates that their colleagues went off with, and then waiting there and operating a buddy system where they worked in partnership with one another. And so there were a lot of, at a time when they couldn't go to the police for support, there were a lot of strategies that sex workers implemented to support one another.
That's a heartening way to end, I think. Look, thank you so much, Cheryl. I just wanted to tell everybody again about your book and when we can expect it, and what it's called, and how they can buy it. Can you let us know again?
Yes, absolutely. The book is called Untold Intimacies, Histories of Sex Work in Aotearoa, New Zealand from 1978 to 2008. And that will be released by Auckland University Press. So it will be available on their website and at bookstores.
Very good. And hopefully in around about April next year, are we thinking?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, very good. I wish you all the best with it. It sounds like a fascinating book. I'll be buying it and reading it. Thank you so much for coming in.
Lovely. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.